For over 3 years, Russian President Vladimir Putin has relied on his military having a massive artillery advantage over Ukraine. He's used that advantage to pelt Ukraine's forces with explosive shells, enabling Russia to take territory and terrorize Ukraine's people. Now, that advantage is coming to an end. A massive pact between Germany and Ukraine's defense manufacturers has just been signed. This deal could end Putin's ammo advantage forever, and we're going to break down why, so stay with us. On May 13th, the German arms manufacturer, Rheinmetall, announced that it had signed an exclusive deal with the Ukrainian Defense Industry Joint Stock Company, also known as Ukroboronprom. Their memorandum of cooperation, which is already signed and sealed, will see the two combine forces to create production facilities for artillery ammunition within Ukraine. In other words, Ukraine won't be relying on its partners to provide ammunition for much longer. With Germany's help, it will transform itself into an artillery producer that can match anything that Putin brings to the table. When announcing the deal, General Director of Ukroboronprom, Ole Huliak, had this to say: "The full-scale war has proven that the need for artillery shells is huge, and the existing capabilities of enterprises are not enough to fully cover it. Therefore, each new ammunition plant, each new production line are critically important for providing the army. We must use all opportunities to create such facilities. And using that opportunity is exactly what Ukraine intends to do." Ukroboronprom signed the deal with Rheinmetall during a special ceremony that took place in Madrid, highlighting that Ukraine's other Western partners are on board. Military reports that it will involve each group working together in the future, though based on separate agreements to build production facilities in Ukraine. Just how much artillery ammunition those facilities are intended to produce, and even when they will come to fruition, is still up in the air. But while cooperation between Rheinmetall and Ukroboronprom is nothing new, there's something else incredibly important happening here. Way back in October 2023, the two groups announced a different collaboration. This early example of Ukraine's defense industry working alongside its Western partners saw the two combine forces to create special workshops in Ukraine dedicated to repairing Western-made military equipment. Those facilities were vital at the time. Not only was Ukraine receiving a massive influx of Western hardware to use in its battle against Russia, but it needed to develop internal expertise related to that hardware. The joint plants offered opportunities for training and allowed Ukraine to extend the lifespans of pieces of equipment that have since proven vital to its war effort. The creation of the joint venture is, without exaggeration, a landmark event that brings cooperation between our countries to a qualitatively new level and will allow us to build the arsenal of the free world together, Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal said at the time. He didn't know just how right he would be. That initial joint enterprise led to the first Ukrainian workshop for repairing Western equipment being opened in June 2024. Right now, that workshop is still hard at work, repairing combat vehicles designed by Rheinmetall and used in Ukraine. With the announcement of their new deal, Rheinmetall and Ukroboronprom are taking their collaboration a step further. This is more than just repairing existing weaponry. Together, the two are going to start building the artillery that could turn the tide of the war in Ukraine's favor. Putin's artillery advantage was a massive reason why his forces were able to advance so deeply into Ukraine. Right now, Russia holds around 20% of the country. Those gains were made because Putin started a war of attrition that saw him combine constant aerial assaults using glide bombs and missiles with wave after wave of ground attacks. Artillery was key to the latter. Each explosive shell delivered against Ukraine's fortifications created gaps in defenses that Russian infantry could exploit. And with a huge artillery advantage, Putin was able to exploit these gaps to make the gains he's made. The deal between Ukroboronprom and Rheinmetall is one of the first signs that Europe is stepping up to bring that advantage to an end. There are others. On April 25th, just a couple of weeks before the landmark deal was announced, United 24 Media published a piece explaining how Europe has transformed its artillery manufacturing since Putin invaded Ukraine. In just 3 years, the outlet claims, Europe has gone from almost handmade production of shells to output that rivals China and could soon outpace Russian production. That turnaround was sorely needed. By early 2024, the US had led the way in providing artillery shells to Ukraine. By that point, it had shipped around 2 million across, and its available supplies were exhausted. The European Union, or EU, had tried, and failed, to keep up. Its donations weren't unimpressive. About 1 million shells had made their way into Ukraine from the EU at that point. However, with the US halting deliveries, Ukraine faced the joint problem of domestic production being limited and the contributions from the EU being dwarfed by the sheer volume of shells making their way into Russia via its partners, such as North Korea. More on that in a moment. By April 2025, the situation was radically different. United 24 says that Europe has stepped into the gap left open by the US halting its artillery ammunition donations. And there are plenty of examples of how. For instance, mid-April saw the British defence manufacturer BAE Systems announce the creation of a new ammunition line at its Glasgow production site. That new line will boost the company's shell output 16 times over compared to their pre-COVID numbers, with new ammunition set to start. Arriving in Ukraine by the fall of this year, Rheinmetall has also been busy. Beyond signing its new agreement with Ukroboronprom, it's expanding its shell manufacturing capacity. NATO, which is a Danish weapons manufacturer, has reopened a previously shuttered facility that it intends to use to build small and large caliber rounds to send into Ukraine. And coming back to Rheinmetall, it's even signed a deal with the STV Group in the Czech Republic to build 1 million shells annually. Combine that with the 300,000 NATO can now produce with its reopened factory. And the thousands of new shells being made by BAE, and you get a filled gap. Not all of those shells will find their way into Ukraine. Some will be held back so that the countries producing them are ready in case Putin decides to extend his ambitions beyond his current war. Still, the numbers don't lie. Europe is stepping up its game. Projections for artillery production by 2026 showcase just how deep the artillery overload runs. Rheinmetall says it'll be building 750,000 shells annually by next year, with plans to boost that to 1.1 million. In 2027, BAE Systems intends to hit 500,000, with STV landing on 150,000. France's Nexter KNDS will be building more than 100,000 new shells by 2026, along with a similar number of shell casings that other countries might be able to load with explosives. Even Poland is getting in on the act. Its defense manufacturer, PGZ, intends to hit production numbers of around 150,000 by 2026. All told, that just about fills the gap of 2 million shells per year left by the US halting its supplies. That's enough to allow Ukraine to fire around 5,000 shells at Russia per day, which is a little under half of the 12,000 shells Putin's forces unload every 24 hours. The deal between Rheinmetall and Ukroboronprom only adds momentum to this artillery turnaround. Beyond the hundreds of thousands of shells it's going to receive from its partners, Ukraine now stands to be able to build its own ammunition in the very near future. Putin will no doubt be stunned by this move. He thought he had the artillery aspect of the war in the bag. And at first glance, it would appear he still does. After all, 12,000 shells per day compared to around 5,000 suggests that Russia still holds the majority of the artillery cards. However, those numbers don't tell the full story. Just a year ago, the situation looked a lot rosier for Russia's forces. For instance, March 2024 saw CNN report that Russia was on pace to produce 3 times more artillery shells than the US and Europe combined. Its manufacturers were building around 250,000 shells monthly, amounting to around 3 million per year, at a time when the US and Europe could only combine to send about 1.2 million shells annually. The US, in particular, was falling behind. Despite having sent about 2 million shells to Ukraine by that point, its defense industry was only building about 100,000 per month. Those low numbers make sense. The US doesn't rely as heavily on ground forces as Russia in a war, preferring to combine them with aerial and naval power for joint strikes. Still, Ukraine seemed to face massive problems. Just a month after the CNN report, Business Insider claimed that Russia's artillery advantage was set to double over Ukraine in just a few months. The reason? Shortages were biting. The US was withdrawing its artillery support, and Europe wasn't quite at the point where it could catch up. But it's here where we start to see the turnaround. Back in April, it was believed that Russia's military was firing 5 times the number of shells Ukraine's military could per day. At that time, US European Command General Chris Cavoli could only see those numbers getting worse. We're not talking about months, we're not talking hypothetically, he told the House Armed Services Committee, adding that the biggest killer on the battlefield is artillery in most conflicts, but in this one, definitely. He also shared numbers that showcased just how handily Putin was set to win that aspect of the war. By the summer of 2024, Cavoli said, Russia would have a 10-to-1 advantage. Ukraine would be stuck on 2,000 shells per day, while Russia's accelerated production would allow it to fire up to 20,000. Those predicted numbers throw the current numbers under a new spotlight. As we mentioned earlier, Russia still has the artillery advantage. However, 12,000 shells per day compared to Ukraine's soon-to-be 5,000 is a massive turnaround from the 10-to-1 advantage Cavoli predicted. Putin now only has just over a 2-to-1 advantage, demonstrating just how rapidly the tide is starting to turn in Ukraine's favor on the ground. The rising levels of European production are playing their role in that turnaround, as are deals such as the one between Rheinmetall and Ukroboronprom that enable Ukraine to boost its domestic production. But there's even more to this story. For one, Russia is much weaker on the artillery shell production front than anybody could have predicted back in 2024. How do we know? Because Putin is relying on one of his partners to supply most of the shells his forces are using today. On April 16th, Pravda reported that North Korea has supplied Russia with between 4 and 6 million artillery shells over the previous 20 months. Those deliveries, which are systematic and have taken place via shadowy sea and rail routes, gave Russia's military a significant boost. All told, Pravda says, the open source center says that there have been at least 64 trips made by Russian ships to the North Korean port of Rajin between September 2023 and March 2025. Those trips have resulted in 16,000 containers of North Korean shells arriving in Russia. Those shells were likely accompanied by other weapon systems, including ballistic missiles, multiple launch rocket systems, and self-propelled artillery units. But hold on a second. Back in April 2024, Russia was supposed to be building 3 million shells per year itself. Yet, here we see that the majority of what Russia is now using in Ukraine is actually coming from North Korea. And, the majority, may not be the correct term. Try, all of it. In its follow-up report on the North Korean artillery shell deliveries, the Moscow Times suggested that what North Korea is now sending to Russia accounts for up to 100% of the shells Putin's forces are now using in Ukraine. Without that North Korean support, Russia couldn't have kept up its artillery bombardments. That's according to the GUR, which is Ukraine's military intelligence agency. Without help from the DPRK, or the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the Russian army shelling of Ukrainian defensive positions would have been cut in half, it says. Without Chairman Kim Jong-un's support, President Vladimir Putin wouldn't really be able to prosecute his war in Ukraine, added former UN panel coordinator Hugh Griffiths. The message was clear: Russia's artillery advantage isn't all that it appears to be. Putin needs his external partners to keep the flow of shells coming into his country just as much as Ukraine needs its partners. And right now, Russia's leader faces a situation where internal production is faltering and his North Korean ally is burning through its stockpiles, while Europe seems to be collectively bolstering the number of shells it can deliver to Ukraine. Add the deal between Rheinmetall and Ukroboronprom into the mix, and Putin also has to deal with Ukraine preparing itself for a significant boost to its domestic production. The artillery situation doesn't look anywhere near as rosy for Russia as it did in 2024. How did things end up getting so bad for Russia? Part of the reason, according to the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, is that Russia's internal economic and material problems are finally coming home to roost. In February 2025, the ISW said those problems are likely to really hit home for Russia in between 12 and 18 months, especially as Ukraine has only grown ever more efficient at inflicting damage on Russia's forces since Putin launched his invasion. The numbers backed up the ISW's assertions. It said at the time that Ukraine had shared just how much of Russia's military hardware it had managed to take out during 3 years of war. On the artillery front, 13,050 of Russia's systems lay in ruins, a number that has grown to 27,780 in May, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance. Therein lies the problem for Putin. He can source as many artillery shells from North Korea as he wants, but they don't mean much when the systems he needs to fire those shells are being raised. To compound the issue, the ISW says that Russia's current artillery system production isn't able to keep up with the current tempo of its losses. It's not even close. Russia can only produce around 50 artillery barrels per year, according to the group's report, and is unable to scale up those numbers. That's because it only has 2 factories capable of building the barrels. Russia's other facilities don't have the specialized machines needed and would become targets for Ukraine's growing missile and drone arsenal if they did. For context, May 13 saw Russia lose 62 of its artillery systems in a single day. If it's only building 50 barrels per year, it's not even building enough in an entire year to replace the systems Ukraine is destroying sometimes in just 1 day. Now we're getting some insight into why Russia's artillery advantage is declining so much. Putin still has plenty of shells, thanks to North Korea. He just doesn't have the guns he needs to fire those shells in the face of a resurgent Ukraine that, thanks to its new deal with Rheinmetall and Europe's collective focus on building new shells, is starting to claw away at the advantage. It all adds up to Putin losing one of the most critical things that he's been able to hold over Ukraine since he launched his invasion. Ukraine's commander-in-chief of its military, Oleksandr Syrsky, hinted at this on April 9. He noted that long-range Ukrainian strikes against Russia's artillery production facilities and existing ammunition stockpiles had cut Russia's rate of daily artillery fire in half. When Putin invaded, Russia's soldiers fired around 40,000 rounds per day. Now, it's 23,000. We continue to expand in this direction, Syrsky said at the time, increasing the number, scale, and capabilities of our deep strike and have already passed the 1,700 kilometers, approximately 1,056 miles, mark. Our teams are also increasing the unmanned component. In other words, while Russia struggles to produce more shells and artillery gun barrels, Ukraine is hitting it hard with missile and drone strikes that eat into its stockpiles. Combine that tactic with things like the new deal between Rheinmetall and Ukroboronprom, along with Europe's collective focus on boosting shell production, and you get a recipe for disaster for Putin's ambitions. So what does the new deal mean for the Ukraine war? It's all bad news for Putin. Artillery is still the critical component in Ukraine's war effort, as noted by the insider. Save for the buzzing of drones overhead, the fighting on the front lines is remarkably similar to the hellscapes of the First World War, it says. Muddy trenches, shell crater-scarred fields, and scorched tree lines are all common sights in eastern Ukraine. Artillery, claims the insider, is the most glaring example of this similarity to warfare tactics from over a century ago. Russia simply hasn't advanced in the way that most other modern military nations have, with artillery remaining Putin's main focus. Now, Russia's leader is seeing the advantage it had in that area being cut significantly as his invasion heads deeper into its 4th year. As for Ukraine, it's only going to get stronger on the artillery front. Back in March, Forbes claimed that Ukraine was already mastering domestic artillery production, as showcased by its refined manufacturing process for the Tu-S22 Bodana. The system, which Ukraine started developing in 2016 and first fielded in 2022, is now catching up to Russia's capability of building 40 howitzers per month. Bear in mind that Russia has the previously mentioned artillery gun barrel problem in play.